Why are people so stupid? Currently, when you encounter most people within our society, you wouldn't, at face value, consider the aggregate to be overall high in intelligence. Making this critique not out of the notion that I'm somehow more intelligent than everybody else, but rather it stems from my anecdotal experience as a teacher and seeing how the formation of generations, both before me and after me, is lacking in the ability to actually form people well and form people in an aspect or a way that develops them or cultivates intelligence in them. Because on an empirical level, what we see is there's declining rates in literacy, declining rates in academic performance, and declining rates in academic motivation across the board. The question is, why is this the case? We can use technology as a scapegoat, and things like short-form content or social media or even the internet as a whole as contributing to this problem, and it certainly is. But beyond that, we have to ask, what about how education is set up is not enticing, or rather mapping onto what students or young people value in their basic day-to-day experiences? When we begin to look at how our education systems are set up and how our culture is set up, it is not set up in a manner that contributes to the impression that we are living within a cohesive, harmonious, or unified totality, or a unified sort of unity of people, of education. On the one hand, when you look at how our education system functions alongside the broader culture, you essentially see the notion, with specifically not just public education, but even forms of private, even religious education as well, is that education prioritizes a fragmented, segmented view of reality that is predicated on the idea that education and knowledge is for the sake of pecuniary, so monetary ends. So children get the impression through education and through the knowledge that they are receiving, which is fundamentally algorithmic, amoral, and lacking in presenting a concrete connection between the knowledge they're learning and their lived experience. Because in essence, how we experience reality is through a series of judgments about the value of things, the value of people, the value of objects. Simultaneously, at every moment that you exist, your consciousness is undergoing a process of prioritization in which you are taking the seemingly infinite data around you and compiling it into a cohesive structure in which you can act in the sense that whenever you look out into the world, in order to act, you have to be willing or valuing something in order to do anything. Because without that series of valuing, without that series of willing, essentially you would be regulated to a merely non-thinking entity, which you are not, which we are not. However, when we look at how the education system functions in relation to our lived experience, everything is about prioritizing facts and data and manipulating those facts and data for the sake of performance, memorizing those facts and data for the sake of performance on a sort of road to a city of almost heavenly corporate capital. The idea is that I will use and manipulate and memorize these facts and data so that I can achieve monetary ends, so that I can achieve a good job, to live in a good house, to get a job working somewhere in which I'm going to be seen in some way as prestigious, a job that is more valuable than others. And what this does to students is it messes with their epistemic experience and causes them to prioritize money making as the most ontologically real thing. And when that coincides along a education system that prioritizes, essentially from their perspective, random sets of facts and data, it creates this sort of tension between how their lived experience is so value laden, but then where they spend 8 to 9 hours a day learning, they are presented with this view of reality in which it is fundamentally algorithmic and computational. And so what this does to the psychology of the student is it essentially creates this sort of juxtaposition between their home, where, hopefully speaking, there are values intact if they have a family, and then their education or knowledge, which is then seen as merely a way to manipulate the world to gain what they want, which is, or what they think they want, or what they think they ought to want, which is getting a good job and getting a good car, a good family, and participating in society almost on a materialistic level outside of maybe the family, of course. When you compare this current or contemporary or normative structure that we experience of education to how education was taught prior or a long time ago with the Greeks, you see a very stark contrast. The Greeks had the notion that knowledge, or our ability to gain knowledge about the world, was or could be a one-to-one correlation, which is the correspondence theory of truth, which is that what my mind can know is directly corresponding to an objective reality. So even when I experience such things as values or such things as morality, there's a one-to-one correlation between my mind and reality. However, as we go through the history of philosophy, what you see with sort of the increased skepticism over time is we adopted forms of nominalism, so rejecting the idea that there's a one-to-one correlation between universal objects and my mind. We see the rise of skepticism, the idea that we should doubt, or we ought to doubt, what are the fundamental truth claims about reality, and that my mind is ultimately not fully connected to reality. We see forms of idealism in Kant, where he would claim that we can't know the thing in itself. We can't actually know what the world is. What I know is mental representations in my mind, a priori. And eventually in the 20th century, with forms of materialism, Marxism, and postmodernism, we see the rejection of all or any meta-narrative to begin with. And how that corresponds with our education system is that when you look at our education system, it is essentially valueless. So there is no clear presented correspondence of values between all of the subjects you study that's building up to a cohesive whole. The many do not become one. The subjects you learn, math, science, English, if you're in a Catholic or a Christian school, theology, etc., they don't correspond or overlap in any meaningful way. Rather, it's the pocket for math, the pocket for theology, the pocket for mathematics, the pocket for science, etc., etc. Compare that to the Greek perspective, which instead was all subjects are participating in or moving towards a logos, a order that is tending towards a ultimate end. We don't see that with our representation of knowledge. And that's a problem, because when you start to destroy any sort of hierarchy or development or cohesive and overlappingness between knowledge of respective sciences, essentially what begins to happen is knowledge itself becomes meaningless. Because without a hierarchy, without some things being valued above others, you essentially destroy the notion that knowledge is valuable at all except for my exertion or manipulation of will upon it to accomplish what I want. This is why education needs to begin to adopt a form of incorporating philosophy into curriculum, because students have to confront their epistemic judgments, so their presuppositional judgments about what knowledge is and what their knowledge is, and confront their own ontology, what they consider to be most real. Because the problem is our current education system does neither of those things. It does not ask students to question how they know what they know about things, and it doesn't challenge students on what they consider to be most real. And in fact, instead, what it does is present students with a screen or mirage that what is most real with regards to your education is essentially money, is essentially practical, pragmatic, pecuniary ends. Development of them, whether they realize it or not, into a corporate entity. Our education system is a factory that is pumping out corporate entities. And so students are sort of left to conclude, ultimately, my values have no place in education and then subsequently society. My values are only reserved for the privacy of my home, and there is no point in even discussing values with peers, discussing a cohesive structure of reality, my interpretation of a cohesive structure of reality with my friends, because there's no room for that. There's no time for that. And so essentially what you get is these students that either become conformists or become incredibly frustrated and disillusioned with education altogether. And that's sort of the typical archetypes you see. It's the people that are highly invested in school because they are thinking about the pecuniary future, the monetary lucrative future that they might have, the prestigious future they might have. Or you have the people that somehow seem disillusioned, whether they realize it or not, with this idea, with the knowledge that they actually have that they're being developed into a corporate entity. However, if we were to move away from that and instead begin to prioritize students' ability to think, students' ability to value things, and challenge that, question that, present to them a cohesive ontology of how the world works, even if you were to not be explicitly theistic with this approach. But at minimum, teaching children something like logic, teaching them deductive and inductive reasoning in a way that's meaningful, in a way that they could question reality, teaching them things like understanding fallacies, understanding how to build arguments. Because if you reject any form of a logos-centric order that we see in the Greeks, the idea that reality is at least at minimum ordered, anything they study has nothing to ground it. If there is no hierarchy of being, if there is nothing that reality is tending towards, and this really is just an infinite flux of random data, in the education system, how it operates is the most functional, which is just random sets of data. And students and young minds shouldn't have to have that be their longest encounter with society through their developing years. And so we need to take an initiative to move towards more logocentric philosophical implementation in our education system. Because if we don't, we're going to continue to pump out either completely disillusioned members of society, members that are disillusioned with the nature of society itself, the nature of knowledge itself, or individuals that are ultimately simply just conformists, that do not question the nature of things, do not question their essential judgments, and do not question what they consider to be most real in any meaningful way. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like below and subscribe. And if you have any comments about maybe things that I missed or things that you would like to critique, please feel free to leave those below, and I'll read and try and respond to every one of them.